Hi to all our listeners. This is the third part of a three-part episode called Pre-Deliverance. If you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, you might want to consider going back and catching up before tackling this one. Part 1. The Hillbilly Jews. The first attempt to place permanent European settlements in southern Appalachia took place in 1566 when a Spaniard named Juan Pardo established forts in both North and South Carolina as well as eastern Tennessee in an effort to link the eastern seaboard of North America with silver mines in Spanish-held Mexico. Pardo was from Cuenca in the La Mancha region of Spain, and we mention him here because Pardo happens to be one of the oldest and most well-known surnames among the Sephardic Jews of Iberia. Whether he actually was Jewish, crypto-Jewish, or a converso, we will probably never know, but he definitely fits the profile for the time, with beleaguered Iberian Jews seeking out new opportunities in distant Spanish and Portuguese colonies to avoid the ongoing persecution of heretics at the hands of the Catholic Inquisition. Whatever about Pardo, whose Appalachian settlements were soon destroyed by indigenous peoples, this did not deter others of Jewish ancestry from taking a chance in the North American interior. During the long century between the late 1500s and late 1600s in particular, it is useful to keep the Protestant Reformation in the front of our minds. Anywhere that Protestant merchants, adventurers, pirates, slave traders, and smugglers were to be found, one would have also found Sephardic, and to a lesser extent, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and Greek Jews. These Jews from the various colonial possessions of England, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands share a story deeply bound up with the African American experience in ways beyond simple slaveholding. This almost forgotten history is known and understood by very few, because these people are notoriously difficult to spot in the historical record. Here are some of the reasons for that. Firstly, Sephardic Jews, much like the Romani, often employed a number of names: a personal Jewish name, a public-facing name, nicknames, and sometimes a separate trade name as well. Secondly, slave trading and slave holding Jews all over the world had often become intermixed with people of color during the 1500s and 1600s. These mixed ethnic communities might include Jews from India, such as the Cochin and Paradisi, West African Jews like Lançados, Atlantic Creoles, Luso-Africans, or the Petticoat of Senegal, South American Jews from the Amazon, Suriname, and other places, Caribbean Jews from Curacao, Jamaica, Barbados. This interethnic mixing took place for a variety of reasons, including being used as a way to secure favorable trade arrangements with local and indigenous peoples. Another reason for interethnic mixing, far less pleasant to consider, was the widespread practice at the time in which slaveholders kept enslaved mistresses of indigenous and African origin, often in open sight of their formal spouses. Remember the Portuguese Jews from our last episode, the ones who arrived in South Carolina and Georgia during the late 1600s and early 1700s. Even among such relatively well-documented, prosperous, and respectable Jewish communities, ethnic boundaries were breached almost immediately, just as had occurred in Dutch and Portuguese colonies. The first medical doctor in Georgia was the Portuguese Jew Diogo Nunes Ribeiro. He and his wife Gracia de Viega de Siqueira, known as Rebecca, brought their children with them from Portugal to Georgia, where all would become slaveholders. One son, Moses Nunes, would keep a slave mistress he called Mulatto Rose, believed to have been of African and Creek Indian descent. Upon his death, Moses manumitted his mistress and all of the children arising from this union, and these mixed ethnic children would eventually intermarry with other mixed ethnic families who would eventually self-identify as white, including the Summerlin ancestors of people like Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. This ethnic intermixing was common among Jewish people in all European colonies, but had been particularly common in South America and the Caribbean. This assertion is by no means speculative. We have eyewitness accounts, like that given by a professional soldier named John Gabriel Stedman, born in the Netherlands to Scottish parents, who wrote a book about his time fighting against the Maroons of Suriname in South America. By the time Stedman arrived in Suriname, Scottish people, including Scottish Highland merchants, had been involved in the transatlantic trade for over a century, able to operate in the grey zone between English and Dutch national interests. Remember that Scotland didn't become a fully integrated part of any United Kingdom of Great Britain until 1707. A Scottish settlement is shown clearly marked on a map of Suriname drawn in 1667. Maroons were communities of escaped slaves who had fled into the jungles of Suriname, where they intermarried with indigenous peoples. These Maroons eventually became a formidable fighting force, launching regular raids on the plantations where they had once been enslaved. A Dutch business venture called the Society of Suriname, along with the self-governing Jewish community at Joden Savannah, the Jews' Savannah, maintained their own militias. But the increasing strength and severity of Maroon attacks meant they felt compelled to seek outside help in what was becoming an all-out guerrilla war. Stedman's Narrative of a 5 Years Expedition Against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname, published in 1796, does not paint a favorable portrait of the Surinamese planter classes. Stedman, who kept a concubine of color himself, tells of shocking abuse and torture of the enslaved population in Suriname by both Dutch and Dutch Jewish slaveholders. This abuse and torture was also being inflicted on slaves by the wives of slaveholders, who took out their rage on their husbands' black concubines and on the endless numbers of mulatto children being born to these consorts. Stedman himself had a mixed ethnic son with his lover Joanna, both of whom he eventually chose to purchase. This odd and rather spooky way of creating a family would also feature in many Anglo-American colonies. Make a mental note of this Stedman fellow. His part in this story isn't quite finished. The so-called mulatto offspring of such liaisons became substantial communities in their own right, often being given extra rations and enjoying special privileges as a way for slaveholders to divide and rule the enslaved population. By the time of the American Revolution, fully 10% of the Jewish population of Suriname was considered black, and a clear majority of so-called white Surinamese Jews had at least some black ancestry. Wars, slave insurrections, raids by pirates, absentee landlords, and the vagaries of a newly emerging world economy led to a series of problems in many European colonies in the Americas, including volatile commodity prices and the subsequent collapse of various banks back in Europe. All of this led many of these Jewish people to leave colonies in South America, the Caribbean, and elsewhere for greener pastures. Wealthier or better connected Jewish families, such as the Nazis, would hold on the longest before eventually leaving their plantations in Suriname for larger cities and towns, some in North America. Cities such as New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Charleston, and New Orleans. Remember David Nassi, who wrote to George Washington in part 2 of this episode? Less wealthy people of Jewish background, whether arriving from Europe or from colonial holdings, whether mixed ethnic or not, had to look for a fresh start in other places. Places where land was still cheap or even free, like the frontier lands of North America. A few of these families managed to maintain their Jewish identity as they moved inland from the coastal towns where they had first arrived. The slaveholding Sextus and Cardozo families, for example, migrated over many generations from Europe to New York and on into South Carolina and Georgia, and to points farther west such as Louisiana, with some family members serving as officers for the Confederacy. Far more of these people abandoned their Jewish faith, at least outwardly, within a couple of generations of arriving in North America, living as they often did outside of cohesive Jewish communities in an often virulently Protestant religious environment. But if we know what to look for, we can find whispers of evidence pointing to the Jewish origins of many more families whose descendants ended up in Appalachia and wider heartland America. Many of the Davenport families of Appalachia seem to trace their lineage back to Humphrey Davenport of Barbados, who arrived in New Amsterdam during the 1600s. Married to a woman named Anna Rosenkrantz, his descendants bore names such as Israel. Perhaps the most telling hint lies in the Y or male genetic haplogroup to which most male descendants belong, J, which is rare among Northern Europeans, but carried by around 10% of Portuguese men and around 58% of modern Israeli men. The DeFries families of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee have a similar story, with family lines tracing back to early New York, where the name was still spelled in the Dutch style, D-E space V-R-I-E-S, a surname extremely common among Dutch Ashkenazic Jews. A surname on its own is, of course, not conclusive evidence of ethnicity, but taken with other evidence, such as family naming conventions, with sons bearing names like Asher, a more persuasive argument can be made. The list of such families is extensive, whether they were seen as white or as people of color. We have Marquez families of New York eventually morphing into the DeMarcus families of Virginia and Tennessee. We find the Poteet family, with descendants popping up in Virginia and North Carolina, some even making their way into the far west, where a Poteet man actually chose the name for the town of Paris, Texas. These people appear to trace back to the Potito merchant family of 1600s Venice. Hints of ethnicity can be discerned in early Maryland land documents, with parcels of land being conveyed bearing names like Levy's tribe, we find an entire nexus of people with likely Jewish roots or connections in earliest colonial Virginia. Surnames like Bass, Bassano, Lanier, Levine, Lovina, Levine, Taliaferro, Tolliver. We have the Midaris families morphing into Meadors and eventually even Meadows throughout southern Appalachia. We will leave these families for now. It would take up to at least half an hour to name every family in colonial America with Jewish ancestry. What we are mostly interested in here is uncovering the possible Jewish origins of many so-called free persons of color, especially those associated with southern Appalachian slavery and so-called isolate communities of Appalachia, like the Melungeons. Many mixed ethnic Jews from places like the Caribbean and South America almost certainly became part of the people enumerated as free people of color in Anglo-America, a term used there in colonial times as a designation for all non-enslaved people who were seen as non-white. Scholars and historians have given these free people of color very little proper deep scrutiny. The few who have bothered to examine the historical documentation, people like Paul Heinig, tend to view matters through the same tired old lens of binary race categories. So anyone named in records or enumerated on census forms as a free person of color, or all other frees except Indians, or even as a mulatto, is automatically assumed by these researchers to have been simply biracial or triracial, unsatisfactory terms meaning Afro-American or Afro-American plus American Indian, white, or both. But when we allow for the presence of other brown people in these records, South Asians, Malagasy, Romani, or Creole Jews, the story becomes far more plausible, complex, and fascinating. But short of finding a Passover menorah while excavating the ruins of a log cabin in eastern Tennessee, how can we support an argument that many free persons of color along the American frontier were at least part Jewish? Before we lay out the evidence, it is worth asking why mixed ethnic Jews would even choose to go into the mountains of southern Appalachia. The economic options available to those Jews seen as white in Anglo-America were rarely limited by formal anti-Semitic legislation. While anti-Semitism certainly existed, as did anti-Catholicism, most Jewish people seen as white were able to carry on their chosen trades and professions. Due to comparatively high literacy rates among Jewish communities since the Middle Ages, and with no religious prohibition on usury, loaning money for interest to non-Jews, most Jewish economic activity had tended to center on the fine crafts, trade, the educated professions, and the financial sector, rather than agriculture. This situation in Europe carried over and usually prevailed in European colonies in the Americas. During the 1700s, for example, we find German Mennonites in Pennsylvania, with a community economy based on practical handcrafts and farming, attempting to exclude Jews on the basis that Jewish businesses, such as money lending for interest, were unnecessary, sinful, and unwelcome. The slave-holding plantocracy of Jewish Suriname was an outlier compared to most other Jewish communities of the time, being experienced at agriculture and agricultural industries. Agriculturalist South American and Caribbean Jews of mixed ethnicity arriving in the port towns and port cities of an increasingly racist Anglo-America would not have been made as welcome as their more white and cosmopolitan fellow Jews from the professional classes. During and after the American Revolution, things got even more difficult for almost all free people of color, including those of Jewish descent, and particularly those of darker complexion or showing any clear signs of partial sub-Saharan African ancestry. Because the British government had guaranteed citizenship to its Jewish subjects, many, but certainly not the majority, had felt a sense of loyalty to the crown. And as loyalists, and this applies especially to loyalists of color, their situation had become almost completely untenable within a post-revolutionary slaveholding white Protestant society now run by patriots. In a case of extreme historical irony, many mixed ethnic families who had been slaveholders for generations were now in danger of being enslaved themselves. Or at the very least, they were being denied the rights afforded to people seen as white. Last of all, formally established Jewish communities had managed to become accepted as white under the Anglo-American racial caste system. And as such, white Jewish slaveholders were often just as bigoted and racist as anyone else at the time, many referring to their erstwhile mixed ethnic cousins in derisory terms, stating that they were not Jechidim, or not to be viewed as somehow comparable to the formerly enslaved Israelites of history. In 1820, the Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim Sephardic Jewish congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, explicitly rejected and refused to accept free people of color as Jewish converts, even when those free persons of color were the children of Jewish men. So remember how we already mentioned that land was still cheap and even free in places like southern Appalachia, at least for those willing to colonize indigenous people's territory? Facing into a hostile social environment in the original 13 colonies, going into the mountains west of the Proclamation Line of 1763, beyond the jurisdiction of any functioning law, must have seemed like a logical recourse for many families from Jewish and multi-ethnic backgrounds, especially if they were slave-holding people of color. And this is exactly what many seem to have done. I'm your host, Brian Halpin, and welcome to the time before we were white. Part 2. Human Traffic. The American frontier offered all free persons of color, including mixed ethnic Jewish settlers, better economic opportunities and a clear respite from the ever more stringent segregation and race legislation being introduced in places like the Carolinas and Virginia. In pre-Revolutionary War times, untapped economic opportunities on the frontier included trading among the Indians, with furs and deerskins being a very lucrative commodity, prospecting for salt, guano, copper, silver, gold, and lead mines. Of course, standard American histories of southern Appalachia only mention square-jawed former patriot and white European frontiers people, especially the much-vaunted Scots-Irish, not mixed-ethnic Jewish traders and former Tories with mulatto family members and slaves in tow. Yet they were there, among the many other more standard Jewish immigrants, a forgotten part of the American story. This is where listeners quite rightly might say, "Give us the evidence." The evidence is circumstantial at times, but extremely compelling. Innumerable Appalachians of dark complexion, often called Melungeons, have traditionally referred to themselves as Portuguese. Outsiders, including many holding PhDs in fields such as sociology and anthropology, have dismissed such claims out of hand, explaining away assertions of Portuguese ancestry as a simple ruse concocted to obfuscate their part African roots. And yet, almost none of these academic theorists have done the actual legwork and hard yards required to compare folklore and superstitions, deep genealogy, naming conventions, intermarriage patterns, migrations, foodways, language, rare disease clustering, burial customs, and DNA patterns in a holistic manner. Others, usually non-academics, have taken these claims of Portuguese ethnicity at face value and theorized a possible descent from Portuguese soldiers and sailors lost or stranded during the 1500s. Neither of these camps mention the fact that in the vast majority of cases, Sephardic Jews in almost every colonial European jurisdiction tended to refer to themselves as Portuguese. Long before skin color became central to various colonial racial caste systems, for Sephardic Jews, crypto-Jews, conversos, Marranos, whatever one chooses to call them, the term Portuguese had become their preferred public identity. Another clue to identity stems from the number of Southern Appalachian people mentioned in various records as free persons of color who were also named as slaveholders. Scholars have long been aware that some free Africans and American-born persons of color had held slaves since earliest colonial times. By 1830, there were around 3,375 people of color scattered around the southern states, holding around 12,760 people in bondage. This out of a southern slave population of over 2 million. This represents just over 0.5% of the enslaved population in the South. Put another way, 1 out of every 200 slaves was held by another person of color. The majority of these slaveholders of color were concentrated in cities such as Charleston and New Orleans, and many of these slaveholders were in fact so-called mulatto, former consorts or mistresses of white slaveholders, or the mixed ethnic children of slaveholders and their consorts. Southern Appalachian slaveholders of color were obviously a tiny subgroup. Yet among this tiny subgroup, a large number are found self-identifying as Portuguese. This clearly begs the question: were these slave-holding people of color really just free African Americans? Or was something else going on here? This problem becomes even more difficult when we try to disentangle those who were actually enslaved from people who were really just the family members of a slaveholder, wives and children of color legally purchased in order to keep a family together. Slaves only on paper, as it were. Whatever about individual cases, a surprising number of free persons of color seem to have become slaveholders very early in American colonial history. This is surprising, mainly because slaves were not cheap. In fact, slaves cost a small fortune. The price of slaves put them well out of the reach of the average white indentured servant who, upon completing their usual 4 to 7 year term of service, were lucky to receive a suit of clothing and a pack of tradesmen's tools. Only the very luckiest might marry a son or daughter of their former master, or even be given a small plot of land to set them on their way in life. The idea that so many free Africans and African Americans had achieved a financial position enabling them to afford slaves by the late 1600s and early 1700s seems counterintuitive. To illustrate this point, consider the following price comparison from the late 1600s. Bear in mind that most transactions in early colonial Virginia were based on tobacco, not coinage or currency. Tobacco was worth just under 3 cents per pound weight. 1 English pound in money was worth about $4.86, with the cheapest unseasoned African slave costing about 5 pounds at the time, or about $24. Unseasoned was the awful word used to describe African slaves not yet accustomed to the American climate and environmental conditions. $1 in 1690 was roughly equivalent to about $83 today. So a slave cost in the region of $2,000 expressed in today's money. At about the same time during the late 1600s, a 40-foot by 20-foot house with 2 floors, each floor divided into 2 rooms, clapboard built, roofed, with 2 chimneys, 1 at each end, cost about £9 or $44 in 1690, about $3,600 today. Put simply, 1 single slave cost more than a recently freed indentured servant or slave might earn in a year, or over half the price of a decent house. Knowing this, could it be that free persons of color, for example, Sephardic Jews, Romani, or Luso-Africans, were bringing slaves into colonies like South Carolina and Virginia themselves, using their own trade connections and networks? There is certainly no reason to think otherwise. In places like English and Dutch Suriname, slaves were often secretly brought ashore to avoid paying fees to the Society of Suriname. The American and Texan folk hero Jim Bowie, defender of the Alamo, made a fortune smuggling slaves into Louisiana with the help of the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte. Bowie was actually born in Kentucky. Smuggling, including human trafficking, was once as American as drinking smuggled rum. As mentioned in an earlier podcast episode, in Finley's History of Russellsville in Logan County, Kentucky, published in 1878, the author walks us through a history of some of the earliest preachers, ministers, and churches in his corner of western Kentucky. In one local history, related by family members themselves, we hear Kentuckians speak of their forefathers. And I quote, "One Morris, a Portuguese, and Bird, Portee, and Goins, Egyptians, were slavers. That is, they owned a vessel which they used to kidnap Negroes from the coast of Africa and transport them to America and sell them into slavery." Unquote. This sounds like nothing so much as a family tradition recalling their ancestors as Sephardic Jewish and Romany slave traders who eventually fetched up in southern Appalachia. And what about the large numbers of free people in southern Appalachia who were enumerated variously as mulattoes, free persons of color, all others, etc., who were not slaveholders, but also referred to themselves as Portuguese? Are they all connected somehow? Luckily, we have a number of other clues to help with an answer. Here is where we finally circle back for a minute to old-time music and banjos. First, some simple facts. As we already learned, the oldest mention of a banjo, or banza, by a similar name and description was in the Caribbean, on Martinique, in 1678. The first unambiguous mention of a banjo-like instrument in North America comes from 1730. Anglo-Irishman Hans Sloane, son of Scottish colonizers of Ulster in Ireland, and collector of many of the artifacts which would form the foundation of the British Museum, mentions a banjo from Virginia colony that year. Remember John Gabriel Stedman, the Maroon Fighter in Suriname? When Stedman returned to the Netherlands, he was carrying a few souvenirs from his time in South America. One of these keepsakes was a musical instrument which he called a Creole banya, which just happens to be the oldest surviving stringed instrument clearly recognizable as a precursor to the modern banjo. It was made sometime before 1777. Just on a curious side note, it is interesting to ask whether Dutch-born Scotsman Stedman was himself of part or full Jewish ancestry. Extraordinary as it might seem, we find a James Stedman Sr., born in 1760 in Charleston, South Carolina, a huge slaveholder or slave trader with roots tracing back to a Robert Stedman of Kinrossshire in Scotland. John Gabriel Stedman himself was also the son of a Robert Stedman. Could he be a cousin or other relation? If so, this would be extraordinary, as the slave-holding descendants of Robert Stedman of Kinrossshire belong to the male Y haplogroup JM102, a group often associated with, you guessed it, Jewish populations. And why on earth did Stedman wish to be buried beside a fake gypsy king named Bamfield Moore Carew in Devon? Whatever his true ethnic background, John Gabriel Stedman was clearly a complex man of hidden depths. But on we must go. It is extremely important to note that many of the earliest so-called whites to play the banjo were actually less white than they might appear. Many came from mixed ethnic Appalachian communities. Not only were they from clearly mixed ethnic backgrounds, many seem to have been of at least partial Jewish ancestry. The clues and evidence found using DNA and genetic genealogy are fascinating to say the least. It is important to bear in mind that belonging to any particular male or female DNA haplogroup is not evidence enough on its own to suggest a particular ethnicity. And many amateur genealogists today who take an autosomal DNA test and believe that its percentages represent the actual ethnicity or cultural community of their ancestors, well, they're not understanding DNA science. When an autosomal DNA test tells us we are 10% Iberian, this doesn't necessarily mean that we had distant great-grandparents from Spain or Portugal. All Europeans, from Sweden to Italy, will share some DNA with the current population of Iberia. After all, most people of European ancestry alive today descend in part from the same wave of Neolithic and Bronze Age immigrants which arrived in Europe over the last 7,000 years or so. This means that if we use a standard population group DNA calculator like the Eurogenes K13, the average English person might show a breakdown of 52% North Atlantic, 22% Baltic, 15% West Mediterranean, 5% West Asian, 3% East Mediterranean, 1% Red Sea, 1% South Asian, and maybe 1% traces from all other regions in the world. What is actually really worth noticing is when things deviate greatly from these expected averages or patterns. If a person from southern Appalachia believes themselves to be of mostly Scots-Irish or English ancestry, but they show, say, 10% East Mediterranean and 5% South Asian, it is definitely worth asking why this should be the case. Likewise, about 62% of Englishmen belong to the R1b Y-DNA haplogroup. Another 25% fall within the I haplogroup, 5% belong to G, 4% to R1a, with the remaining few percent divided between haplogroups E1b and J. These latter E1b and J male haplogroups can occur all over Europe. Roughly speaking, the farther south and east we go, the more common they become. EM35 occurs in only about 1 to 3% of Englishmen. JM172 follows a similar distribution pattern, being rare in Britain, but found among a much higher percentage of Palestinians, Balkan Romani, and Sephardic Jews. Belonging to either of those haplogroups on its own does not mean a person is Jewish, or anything else for that matter. Many ancient male Jewish lineages are in fact part of the RM269 haplogroup, the most widespread and common haplogroup in Europe. But when men and family lines show up with quite rare Y DNA types in clusters or entire communities, in frequencies well above what might be randomly expected, it again becomes worthwhile to ask why. And while it does not necessarily make for compelling listening, it is important that we name some names here, if only to drive home the sheer number of Southern Appalachian males who belong to DNA haplogroups which are rare among males in Northern Europe and less common in Central Europe too. Under the J haplogroup, we find surnames like Ambergy, Asher, Blankenship, Brock, Bryce, Bunch, Cardozo, Carrico, Clements, Coleman, Collett, Cox, Crouch, Durfee, Goforth, Hobson, Isom, Keltner, Locke, Maynard, Parsons, Pittman, Rains, Rector, Scruggs, Shiflett, Stagner, Tarpley, Via, Wagers, Wingo, Wooten, Younger, Humans. Under the E1B and related haplogroups, we find surnames like Blevins, Cabbage, Calhoun, Cheek, Chrysler, Cold Iron, DeMarcus, Desarn, Epperson, Faust, Goins, Hatfield, Hefner, Hubbard, Hurd, Jacobs, Killian, Lanier, Likens, Lyons, Meadors, Merritt, Prater, Satterfield, Shepherd, Shirley, Silvers, Sizemore, Stapp, Swan, Swords, Tolliver, Walker, Yowl. Anyone from the mountain parts of southern Appalachia will recognize most of these surnames. Another hallmark of southern Appalachia is the sheer number of mixed ethnic families bearing surnames which appear to be borrowed from families of more or less demonstrably European descent. We can suspect such name borrowing where male descendants belong to a Native American or African Y haplogroup. This is the most common category of borrowed or assumed surnames. Other assumed surnames might arise from adoptions, non-paternal events, criminal aliases, or when someone from a non-Anglo linguistic background translates their surname into English, as in Schmidt to Smith, or if they choose an English surname which sounds similar to their original name, like Meadows to Meadows. Some people simply picked a brand new surname out of the hat, just as the first Jews in German-speaking lands with Hebrew names became Rosenbergs and Goldsteins in their public lives. In America, some of the people most likely to carry surnames utterly unrelated to their actual ancestry, aside from African Americans and Indigenous Americans, obviously, are people of Romani and Jewish descent who, due to being cut off from their larger ethnic communities for generations, have often lost any folk memory of their original origins. Between indigenous peoples, the formerly enslaved, runaway servants, free persons of color, criminals and outlaws, people of non-Anglo background, Jews, Romani, Southern Appalachian surnames are very much a hit-and-miss indicator of actual ancestry. This is also why we see so many of what might be called doppelganger family lineages. Blankenships, Bolings, Dements, Mullins, Presleys, Scruggs, Sizemores, Swaffords. People with these and many hundreds of other surnames often trace their ancestry back into the mists of colonial American history, believing that they share a common ancestor. Yet one set of descendants will share a typical European haplogroup, while other lines will belong to Indigenous American, Sub-Saharan African, Middle Eastern, North African, or South Asian or Romani haplogroups. As to those suspected specifically of Jewish ancestry, we've already mentioned many clues. People of dark complexion calling themselves Portuguese, people who are slaveholders while often being enumerated as people of color themselves, people belonging to Y-DNA haplogroups associated with Middle Eastern populations. But perhaps most telling are the innumerable families having absolutely no documentary trail whatsoever which might show how they entered America. No record of any contract of indenture, no listing in ship manifests, no record of being transported under the headright system or under sentence of penal transportation. Yet even this is not all. Many families of suspected Jewish ancestry, once they had been cut off from any chance of engaging with their own religious communities, seem to have gravitated toward Quaker communities. Because Quaker meetings had no overt rituals or ceremony, one is tempted to wonder if this form of Christian fellowship was especially appealing to people of an indigenous Muslim or Jewish or mixed background, as they weren't required to participate in any sacraments or expected to offer any overt public display of Christian faith, such as baptism. Those who listened to episode 8 of this podcast, The Witch in the Tent Grave, will have learned about the curious tent-shaped graves of the Cumberland Plateau, which bear an uncanny resemblance to Sephardic Jewish graves found in the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa. A spate of witchcraft accusations leveled against both men and women in this region during the early 1800s makes one wonder if Melungeons of partial Jewish, Romani, African, and indigenous ancestry were being persecuted for the practice of unfamiliar folk magic. To this day, certain foods are common among Appalachian descendants of these multi-ethnic people. In fairness, it's probably impossible to say whether mountain specialities like cabbage rolls only arrived with late 19th century immigrants to the coal towns, or if they are part of an older tradition. Still, any Jewish person alive today would recognize Appalachian cabbage rolls as holishkas. But of all the clues to ethnicity, none seem as tantalizing and evocative as the odd naming patterns and naming conventions of southern Appalachia. The same first names and middle names occur again and again over decades and centuries, like discrete signposts or hidden messages. What makes these naming patterns so peculiar is the way they seem to be passed down in families bearing surnames which appear to be of Anglo, German, Spanish, and other European ethnic backgrounds, yet there is no discernible connection to any relatives, living or dead, who actually bore those surnames. Who on earth were these names meant to honor or remember? What did they signify? Any southern Appalachian today will spot such names immediately. Berry, Green, Greenberry, King, Lee, Littleberry, Wiley, Riley, Preston, Patton. We don't even have time to scratch the surface with women's names. Emizetta, Parazetta, Artemisia, Marinda, not to be confused with Miranda, Araminta, Altamira, Keziah, Diadema, Lodusky, and so many more. Then we have the Appalachian surnames, which match many families who were slaveholders and free people of color in the Caribbean. Bowling, Combs, and more. Perhaps most obvious of all, aside from the people with names like Asher and Israel, King David and King Solomon, is the fact that many mixed-ethnic Melungeon surnames, such as Tolliver, Mullins, and Lyons, can be found right there among the documented Sephardim of early 1700s Georgia. David Lopez d'Oliveira, sounds like Tolliver. Abraham de Mullins, Abraham de Lyons or Lyons, Lions. Other Melungeon-related surnames, such as Driggers, have their origins among even earlier people of colonial Virginia with the surname Rodriguez, also very likely to have been Sephardic Jews. I think this is probably enough for the purposes of this podcast. We could spend literally days going through migration and intermarriage patterns and sundry other types of clues and evidence. It is clear that people of Jewish background, mixed and less mixed, slave and free, are part of the story of Appalachia and Appalachian culture. So let's be clear what we are not saying. We are not trying to displace the banjo from its earliest origins among African peoples brought against their will to the Americas and Caribbean. We are not attempting to minimize the banjo's historical importance at the center of Black culture and spirituality. We are not saying that modern country music hasn't been profoundly influenced by Black traditions. We're not even calling the Appalachian banjo tradition Jewish in any meaningful cultural sense. These people of Jewish and part Jewish ancestry became largely assimilated into a more general Appalachian mountain culture, just like so many others. We are not saying that minstrelsy did not contribute to the popularity of the banjo. What we are doing is pointing out another pathway by which the banjo almost certainly entered southern Appalachia, and how it may have ended up being played by people of all ethnic backgrounds there, long before the age of minstrelsy. So if that's what we're not saying, what are we actually saying? Currently, there is only one widely accepted history of the banjo in country music, which states that the banjo was played only by African Americans until white people appropriated it during the age of blackface minstrel shows in the mid-1800s. This may be true in many cases, but almost certainly not in southern Appalachia. There is no single history of the banjo. There are many histories. The complex mixed ethnic ancestry of many Appalachians, especially among the underclasses, means the Appalachian story of the banjo is completely unique and different to the story of its journey and development elsewhere. We already mentioned the first appearance of the banjo in written records in North America was in 1730 in Virginia, a state whose population was 20% free persons of color at around the same point in time. These free persons of color were often small slaveholders. There is zero reason to believe that the slaves they held were unfamiliar with the banjo. There is also zero reason to believe that these free persons of color, or anyone else living in the Virginia and Carolina backcountry, would have been unfamiliar with the banjo in 1730. There is, in fact, no compelling reason to think that free persons of color and underclass white indentured servants weren't playing banjos or something similar right alongside enslaved people as far back as in the late 1600s. These very same free persons of color began entering Appalachia, many with both indigenous and African slaves, well before the American Revolution. Why should we think that these free persons of color, with or without slaves, didn't bring their folk traditions into the mountains with them? Folk traditions including musical instruments like the banjo. One of the originators of blackface minstrel shows, Dan Emmett, hired his first banjo player in around the year 1840. This musician's name was Ferguson, and he came from the mountains of Western Virginia, not the plantations of Eastern Virginia or the Deep South. In the racist parlance of the time, this man was said to be an Irishman, more Negro than a Negro. I've actually replaced the N-word used at the time with something only slightly less offensive there. Ferguson was described as an old man in 1840, so he was almost certainly born around the time of the American Revolution. How and when he came to play the banjo is unclear. What is certain is that he was seen as a very low-class sort of white person, and that he was playing the banjo before blackface shows had been invented. Writing in 1870, a doctor named Daniel Drake reminisced about his childhood in mid-Appalachia nearly 70 years earlier. In this memoir, he recounts some of the rough and ready characters he spoke with during those frontier days, including an old man of German descent named Rector, who explained the centrality of deer hunting to the survival of the earliest frontiers people. Deer furnished not only food and clothing, but in his own words, fiddle strings for the banjo, known as catgut. Which means that some Appalachian music traditions, thought to derive only from the time of blackface minstrel shows, were in fact older music traditions, which had developed among mixed ethnic communities over the course of 2 centuries. These traditions eventually came to be seen as white because over many decades, Appalachian free persons of color passed into whiteness. Jim Crow laws began to take root and spread, and many African Americans left the mountains for points north. Record company marketing men did the rest. Many, but not all of these now mostly white free persons of color, including those known as Melungeons, appear to have been people of Jewish or Jewish Creole background from European colonies founded in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. At the very least, many Appalachian musicians, including banjo players, came from a mixed ethnic background. Whether this mixed ancestry included multi-ethnic Sephardim, their slaves, or both, or something else altogether, is a field worthy of further serious research. All of this means that Appalachian musical traditions, and by extension the country music which grew in part from it, are truly multi-ethnic traditions, neither exclusively black nor white in origin. We are currently going through a bit of a cultural moment, with many people of colour happily rediscovering their ancestors' huge part in the birth of country music and seeking to reclaim it. In our eagerness to right the wrongs of the past, in which country music was marketed and sold as being somehow exclusive to white rural America, we cannot allow country music to become another battleground in the ongoing culture wars, in which the old binary race lens forces us to see the roots or ownership of country music as being necessarily a black thing or a white thing. This being an audio recording, I don't want to holler this, so take this next sentence as if it were written in capital letters. Identity politics often obscures more than it elucidates. When we call food or music black or white, we are suggesting that skin color takes precedence over lived culture, or that skin color and lived culture are always inextricably linked. In a mixed ethnic Appalachian context, all of these lines are too blurred to have any real relevance. The African-American jazz musician Willie Ruff, who passed away sadly just last Christmas Eve, taught at Yale's Faculty of Musicology for many years. One of his most surprising theories concerned a suspected link between black gospel music and the Scottish Hebridean psalm singing tradition known as presenting the line or lining out. Does this mean that Cleotha Staples, Mahalia Jackson, or Aretha Franklin were singing the music of Scottish Islanders? No, of course not. Music has always been a malleable form of expression, hopping between ethnicities and cultures, ever changing. Tomatoes, potatoes, and chocolate were first brought to Europe from America 400 years ago. No one would dream of calling Italian spaghetti sauce, German potato dumplings, or Belgian chocolate indigenous American food. Similarly, the banjo belongs to many people now, whatever its ultimate origins. Appalachian instruments had a few things in common. They were usually, but not always, cheap or homemade. Most of all, they were portable. Jews' harps and mouth bows, bones and spoons, homemade pipes and flutes, jugs and washboards, pocket fiddles and box fiddles and proper fiddles, washtub bass, dulcimers, psalteries, banjos. The music actually played on these instruments came from a myriad of cultures: English, Scots, Welsh and Irish, German and Swiss, Swedish and Finnish, French, Romani and Jewish, Berber, Gambian, Senegalese and Angolan, Portuguese Creoles from Madagascar, Lascars from South Asia, Lenape, Shawnee, Cherokee, and other peoples indigenous to the Appalachian Mountains. All of these rich cultural and ethnic ingredients becoming characterized simply as black or white is a tragic hangover from America's caste system. People of every color arrived in America from many places, representing scores, if not hundreds, of distinct ethnic groups and polities, with their own religions, food, and music traditions. While the ultimate social division was obviously slave or free, there were thousands of different forms and levels of interaction between all of these ethnic groups over the centuries. There is no such thing as a monolithic rural black culture or a monolithic rural white culture. When we characterize every human being, every musician, as being either black or white, and treat skin color as a stand-in for ethnicity, we ignore the vast underground river of people who never fit neatly into either of those categories. Like Southern Appalachians. While outsiders might like to make jokes about mountain inbreeding, the fact is that Southern Appalachians were probably the most mixed ethnic population in the eastern USA until the 20th century. This melding pot created Appalachian culture, and old-time Appalachian mountain music is a core foundational part of modern country music, alongside ragtime, Delta blues, Piedmont blues, Western Hispanic and Mexican music, Cajun and Hawaiian music, and much, much more. Old-time Appalachian mountain music simply would not exist without the past input of people from almost everywhere. This mixing is exactly what makes it sound distinct. We should not say that a black or indigenous string band in 1920s Appalachia was playing white music just because they were using non-African fiddles and guitars. And we should not say a white string band in 1920s Appalachia was playing black music when they employed a banjo. They were all playing Southern Appalachian music. Some people involved in highlighting the contribution of Black America to the birth of country music have suggested that when we highlight the complex, multi-ethnic roots of country music, we are just finding another way of recentering whiteness to the detriment of black history. Quite the contrary. It is high time we decentered the entire black or white binary race system once and for all, and begin to place actual ethnic history and cultural history at the center. White and black are not, and never were, ethnicities. They were positions a person got assigned within a racialist and racist caste system, and they were arbitrary. Saying that country music came from white culture is a reductionist stoking of the culture wars. By the same token, saying that country music came from black culture is also a reductionist stoking of the culture wars. If the roots of commercial country music have a core culture and ethnicity, then it is Appalachian. And if people must insist on describing Appalachian culture and music in terms of skin color, instead of by its true multi-ethnic nature, then the color of Appalachia is brown. Don't believe it? Get ready to be surprised. Part 3. Delivered. As we approach the conclusion of this epic 3-part podcast, let's name check some actual old-time musicians and explain something about their place within a wider ethnic and cultural context. They say that smell goes to the heart of our being like nothing else. To the sense of smell, I would add language and musical memories, the particular words and phrases, rhythms and rhymes, hummed lullabies and whistled melodies shared only among our own family and community. The food we eat together, the stories we tell each other, the music we share in common. All of these lie at the beating heart of our core identity. After listening to this podcast, go to the internet. Type in any form of search terms asking about the settlement and culture of Southern Appalachia. There you will find the almost universal assertion that Appalachian ethnicity and culture is partly English and German, but primarily Scots-Irish. Yet so many old-time Appalachian folk customs, superstitions, foodways, stories, and musical traditions have been preserved and carried forward by brown people with little, if any, discernible Scots-Irish ancestry. Consider some of the following old-time singers and musicians considered as being from a solely white background under America's racialist way of viewing culture and ethnicity. This is merely a sample and is far from being a comprehensive overview. Norman Edmonds, 1889 to 1976, old-time fiddle player. Edmonds had Mabry and Dalton, ancestors of color. William Bays, 1821 to 1878, also an old-time fiddle player. William was said to have been half Cherokee, but more likely he was descended from a family intermarried with indigenous people in 1600s Virginia, possibly Pamunkey. Fiddlin' Billy was a direct ancestor of June Carter Cash of the Carter family and wife of Johnny Cash. Samantha Bumgarner, 1878 to 1960. Singer and fiddler and pioneer of old-time music recording. Samantha Bumgarner, born Samantha Biddix, cut the earliest female country music recordings in history, along with her banjo-playing partner Eva Davis, in 1924. The tracks they recorded included the murder ballad Wild Bill Jones, sung by Eva to her own banjo accompaniment, a pure slice of mountain invention with no obvious roots in the song traditions of Ireland, Scotland, or anywhere else for that matter. The roots of Eva Davis are obscure, to say the least. Samantha's ancestry is scarcely easier to trace, but we do know that the Huntley folks on her maternal side count Meaders people among their ancestors, a Portuguese surname which pops up time and time again among mixed ethnic Appalachian folks. Samantha's sister Ella married the son of Jewish immigrants. John Sawyer, 1882 to 1952. Fiddle player on many early field recordings of old-time music. John Sawyer was part of a community often called the Magoffin County Indians, a complex ethnic population of eastern Kentucky. His male Prater ancestors belonged to Y DNA haplogroup EM35. An early Sawyer ancestor was actually a Tory fugitive who took to the mountains, while his great-uncle Samuel Sawyer is believed to have sired dozens of children by various women of different ethnic backgrounds. William Henry Whitter, 1892 to 1941, multi-instrumentalist and singer. Henry Whitter was from Grayson County in the western mountain country of Virginia, snuggled up against the North Carolina border, and was among the very earliest people to record old-time music, way back in 1923 and 1924. Both sides of his family had been in the mountains since around the time of the American Revolution, and like most southern Appalachian families, Whitter's own family may have passed as white under American race laws, but even basic research shows free people of color abounding among his maternal grandparents. Various great aunts intermarried with the Melungeon Sexton family, and uncles intermarried with the apparently Sephardic Jewish Carrico family. Old Joe Clark. This one's not actually a band or a person, but a famous mountain song. In 1923 and 1924, a 55-year-old man from Georgia and the 46-year-old leader of a family string band separately laid down what are generally considered among the first ever commercial old-time country music recordings. One of these men was named John Carson, and the string band ensemble was called Fiddlin' Powers and Family. All of these musicians made recordings for the recently incorporated OK Records, founded in New York by German Jewish immigrant Otto Karl Yehuda Heinemann. All of them would also produce recordings for Victor Records before that company was bought out to become RCA Victor, and both would make an early recording of the song Old Joe Clark within a year of one another. This one song and these two early recordings of it could almost stand as exemplars of the completely different and competing histories of commercial American country music. In the first instance, it must be noted that Old Joe Clark is a whimsical Appalachian song based on the exaggerated exploits of a real mountain man from eastern Kentucky who was murdered in 1885 after spreading himself a bit too thin among a number of women. The tune is also notable for using a proto-blues scale well before the term blues had even entered wide circulation. James Cowan Powers, father and leader of the Fiddlin' Powers and Family String Band, was from Russell County in the far west of Virginia in mountain country. The Powers family had already settled in the region between the Blue Ridge Mountains and Appalachian Mountains just a few years after the American Revolution. Cowan Powers people were of mixed ethnicity, including the Sawyers people, who would give their name to a community in Kentucky called the Salyersville Indians. Other ancestors included the Osbornes, with free people of color counted among their number. The blended nature of many Appalachian communities can be seen in the fact that at the age of 33, Cowan Powers and his family lived right next door to a family enumerated as mulattoes in the 1910 census. One of Powers' other direct ancestors was a man of apparent German ancestry named Jacob Kassel, probably from the German surname Kassel or Kessel, a frontiersman who had ventured into Appalachia a full quarter century before the American Revolution as a long hunter and trader among the Indians, taking what appears to have been a number of wives or concubines of the Shawnee and Cherokee nations while hunting and trapping in the mountains of what is now Russell County, Virginia. People like Cowan Powers and his family lived and breathed mountain culture, its ballads and tunes acting as a form of shared community lore and memory. The great-grandfather of Powers' wife, Matilda Lambert, for example, was murdered by a man named John Elliott in 1816. Elliott was saved from the noose by some lofty oratory given to the jury by another mountain man named Abner Vance, the grandfather of Devil Anse Hatfield of the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud. Vance himself would swing at the end of a rope just 3 years later in 1819 for another murder. His oratory skills were at play once again at his hanging, where he is said to have spoken eloquently for over an hour and a half to a huge crowd of onlookers, but this time to no avail. As so often in Appalachia, Vance is said to have written his own death ballad while awaiting execution in jail, and the Vance song can still be found on YouTube today. We will be exploring the complex ethnic roots of the people involved in mountain feud culture in an upcoming podcast episode. Spoiler alert, these people were almost never Scots-Irish. Whatever about their ethnicity, when people like Cowan Powers sang songs like Old Joe Clark, they were raising ghosts and singing aloud the life and times of their own people. In total contrast, Fiddlin' John Carson's family were part of a contingent of Scots-Irish who first arrived on ships from Scotland and Ireland directly onto South Carolina's shores at around the time of the American Revolution, before moving west into the hills of North Georgia in the mid-1800s, generations after the first settlers there. In other words, John Carson's family had relatively shallow roots in old southern Appalachian culture compared to the Powers family. What this means is that while folks like Cowan Powers were likely to have learned songs like Old Joe Clark from the mixed ethnic people of their own mountain community, Carson probably picked the tune up from the many mountain folks who were beginning to find work in the textile mills near his home in Georgia. Carson started playing the fiddle in his teens, and 20 years later was writing songs of his own. Unlike the subject matter of old-time mountain music, Carson's own songs dealt with contemporary events in Georgia, such as the murder of factory girl Mary Fagan. It is believed that Carson's conspiracy theory-tainted Ballad of Mary Fagan contributed to the lynching of Jewish factory superintendent Leo Frank. Carson was a virulent racist and supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, writing songs for and lending his support to the political campaigns of white supremacist politicians like Tom Watson and Gene Talmadge. It is an affront to the memory of old-time mountain singers and musicians everywhere that later, when the time came for the recording industry to discover old-time music, and once there was some money to be made in it, racist opportunists like John Carson would dress up his own daughter, Rosalie Carson, in the mock garb of mountain culture and create for her the stage name Moonshine Kate as he proceeded to cash in. Hillbilly face, just like blackface, was a thing. Carson reached for a repertoire and marketing image belonging to a people he did not belong to nor understand. We can know this because if he had truly understood these people, he would have almost certainly spewed racist bile at them and their music. It is perhaps not too much of a stretch to suggest that Fiddlin' John Carson was the godfather to those who would turn country music into white music in the eyes of the public, hooking its wagon to a racist and bigoted social and political outlook as it set out on a long, straight and narrow road, leading to current, inauthentic practitioners such as the execrable Jason Aldean. The whiteness of country music was a sham in 1924, and it's even more of a sham today, exactly 100 years later. And what about some other famous old-time musicians? June Carter Cash, 1929 to 2003. Member of the famous Carter family of musicians. June Carter, second wife of country music legend Johnny Cash, was descended on both sides of her family from some of the earliest settlers of the area around Scott County, Virginia. Some of her ancestors, such as the Stallards, are mentioned as early as 1812 in the minutes of the Stony Creek Baptist Church, where a Susanna Stallard stood accused of harboring Melungeons in her home. Those who follow this podcast regularly will know that Melungeons are a community of dark-complected, mixed-ethnic people of southern Appalachia. Stony Creek Baptist Church counted people of color among its members, as well as Sweeneys, a family connected to none other than Joel Walker Sweeney, the first blackface minstrel. June Carter's male Addington ancestors, here we go again, belong to the EM35 haplogroup, so common among Melungeon populations. The Carter family included June's mother, Maybelle Carter, and June's paternal uncle, A.P. Carter, and his wife, Sarah. Alvin Pleasant Carter tramped the mountains of western Virginia in the company of a black gentleman named Leslie Riddle, collecting songs while visiting the homes of people from every ethnic background. AP taking down the words, Leslie memorizing the music. It would be many years before Leslie Riddle received proper recognition for his part in helping to create the American Country Music Songbook, or for teaching Maybelle Carter how to play her famous scratch style of guitar, which got passed on to her son-in-law, Johnny Cash. What is maybe the most important thing to note here is the fact that neither the Carters nor Leslie Riddle differentiated between black music and white music. The songs they gathered were part of a legacy shared by mountain folks of every color, which is no wonder, as the Carter family counted people of non-European background among many of their mountain ancestors, particularly those bearing surnames such as Bays and Nichols. William Hamilton Stepp, better known as Bill or W.H. Stepp, 1875 to 1957, old-time fiddle player. Bill Stepp had a hard start in life, a thing not uncommon among the mixed ethnic mountain people of eastern Kentucky. Bill was born out of wedlock, along with two siblings, to a half-indigenous American mother who had been forced into prostitution by extreme poverty. Needless to say, Stepp's father, William Seal, was a scoundrel masquerading as an upright citizen and took no responsibility for the children he sired through his dalliances with desperate women like Lucinda Stepp, who eventually ended up in jail and lost custody of her children when her son Bill was only 5 years old. Luckily for American culture, Bill Stepp transcended his difficult beginnings to become a hugely popular and influential fiddle player. Stepp's recorded version of Bonaparte's Retreat is a touchstone in the history of old-time music. Stepp was married at least 5 times, and all bar one of his wives came from the Old Mix people of southern Appalachia, mostly from families of French extraction who had intermarried with indigenous people and other people of color. Cordelia Noe, Hester Arnott, and Nanny and Martha Sawyer, the latter being cousins, and both from the Magoffin County Indian community. Ernest Van Pop Stoneman, 1893 to 1968, commercial country music pioneer. Pop Stoneman is universally acknowledged as one of the founding fathers of commercially recorded old-time country music, along with his wife Hattie Frost. Stoneman played clawhammer-style banjo, Jew's harp, auto harp, guitar, and harmonica. He also had 3 persons of color on his Stoneman and Lundy paternal family lines. Doc Watson, 1923 to 2012, folk, country, gospel, and bluegrass singer-songwriter and guitar player. Arthur Lane Watson, better known as Doc Watson, went blind before his 2nd birthday, and like many blind people of the time, eventually found his place in music. Ancestral surnames include Gold and Triplet, both families of suspected Jewish ancestry. The Triplets were among the earliest slaveholders of colonial Virginia, and intriguingly, men of triplet ancestry belong to a Y DNA haplogroup usually associated with populations found around the Horn of Africa, near modern Eritrea and Somalia. Now let's talk about some celebrated banjo players in particular, like Tom Ashley, 1895 to 1967, old-style clawhammer banjo player and late minstrel show performer. Ashley was taught to play music by the women in his family and ended up playing later with the Carolina Tar Heels. He also played with the blind fiddler G.B. Grayson outside coal camp pay shacks during the era of the Great Depression. Ashley had both McCurry and Sizemore ancestors. It is worth noting the McCurry family connections to the maternal family of Barack Obama, while the Sizemores belong to haplogroups which are European, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous American. Joseph B. Bowling, 1877 to 1955. Joe Bowling was descended from the family known among Appalachians as the Blue Bowlings because they appeared out of the blue in early 1700s Virginia, entirely unrelated to the patrician Red Bowling family of Virginia, which claims direct descent from Pocahontas. This is a prime example of a colonial-era doppelganger family. Most descendants of the so-called Red Bowlings belong to the European haplogroup RM269, while Blue Bowling lines can include haplogroups EM2, EM35, and TM70, which is to say, male DNA haplos associated with African and Middle Eastern populations. Thomas Tom Couch Jr., born around 1858. This would be the father of the James Couch, who was interviewed by a man named Leonard Roberts. Tom Couch had 3 persons of color in his Hash family lines on his paternal side. The Hashes being a mixed ethnic family from places like Grayson County, Virginia, the name apparently taken from the French surname Hesh. Tom Couch told of his father making homemade banjos out of gourd. Couch people also intermarried with Meadors or Medaris people of apparent Portuguese Jewish ancestry. Wiley Davidson, 1880 to 1977. Banjo player Wiley Davidson had a fiddle-playing ancestor named Isaac Callahan, who was hanged for murder. His Davidson ancestors were slaveholders, so it's difficult to know if Wiley was a spark of a liaison with enslaved women or a so-called legitimate descendant. Davidson also had Brock ancestors, which appear to be, you guessed it, of Jewish descent. Estelle de Hart, born 1898. Estelle de Hart's ancestry goes right back to the de Harts of New Amsterdam and suspected Sephardic Jewish people. When we try to understand the history of the Dutch de Harts of New Amsterdam, we should also remember to look at the mixed ethnic de Harts of Suriname, also related to mixed ethnic Pennington slaveholders of eastern Kentucky. Snuffy Jenkins, 1908 to 1990. Early proponent of the three-finger style of banjo picking. Jenkins' ancestry remains unclear on many lines, but does include hoppers, many of whom descend from the Hoppe family of Dutch New Amsterdam, which can include people of Jewish and indigenous ancestry. Ancestors also include the slaveholding Surratt families, most notable for John Surratt and his mother's part in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. John Preston Nestor, or J.P. Nestor, 1876 to 1967. Old-time singer and banjo player. Nestor had 3 persons of color on both his Dalton and Koch family lines. Sonny Osborne, 1937 to 2021. Osborne was also related to Sizemores, Blevins, and Bowlings, and other families who all appear to have indigenous and Jewish ancestry. Morgan Sexton, 1911 to 1992. Sexton had 3 persons of color, or Melungeons, on his paternal side, including the Sextons, Moores, and Gibsons. Mixed ethnic Cornet people are enumerated as 3 persons of color on his maternal side, Cornets being another family with untraceable deep roots, possibly Sinti or German Romany people. Alan Shelton, 1936 to 2009, member of bluegrass band Jim and Jesse and the Virginia Boys. Shelton had Asher ancestors who carry the J haplo typical of Jewish populations. His Bean ancestry is often said to have been of Métis or mixed descent. Hobart Smith, 1897 to 1965. Virtuoso banjo player and multi-instrumentalist. Smith was taught to play fiddle by an African-American lodger in his family's home named Jim Spencer. While people have remarked on how Spencer's style informed Hobart's playing, especially in terms of the blues tinge present in tunes like Last Chance, what is even more noteworthy is the fact of Spencer's presence in an ostensibly white household at all, and Hobart's willingness to frequent mostly black night spots around Saltville, Virginia, during the height of the Jim Crow era. This crossing of the color line is a constant theme among Old Mix Americans and the Melungeons of Appalachia. Both of Hobart's parents were banjo players, and his Hammond's ancestors are often enumerated as free persons of color. And nearly forgot. One of Hobart Smith's wives was descended from the mixed ethnic Knuckles families and carried the maiden name of Meadows. And yes, that would be the Portuguese Madoris people. Dr. Coble Doc Walsh, banjo king of the Carolinas, played with the Carolina Tar Heels. Poteet and Goforth ancestors, both probably Jewish. Ralph Stanley, 1927 to 2016, singer, bluegrass banjo player. Ralph Stanley learned the clawhammer banjo from his mother, and Stanley was a Melungeon to the core. His great-grandmother on the paternal side was named Rebecca Beverly, and photos appear to show a woman of color. Rebecca appears to be descended from the Beverly family, which included privateers or pirates operating around the Bahamas in the early 1700s, including Harry Beverly, who was captured by the Spanish and held in Vera Cruz before escaping and making his way back to Virginia. Other family lines include Rose, Smith, Music, rather appropriately, Robinette, Counts, and McCoy, with sundry slaveholders among them. Stanley Smith and Rose surnames and intermarriage patterns suggest part Romany ancestry, while family folk tradition refers to Count's ancestors from the Fort Germana settlers named Kuntz as being Black Dutch, a term which in Appalachia can mean partial Romany, indigenous, African, or Jewish ancestry. Members of Stanley's backing band for much of his career, the Clinch Mountain Boys, reads like a who's who of mixed ethnic southern Appalachia, including players bearing well-known Melungeon surnames like Mullins, Sizemore, and Goins. I'm going to throw this one in just for fun. Steve Martin, born 1946, famous actor, comedian, and banjo picker. Martin is descended from the apparently Jewish Davenports of New Amsterdam. Another Martin ancestor was Bloody Bob Martin, a Confederate conscript hunter who was noted as being a quadroon Indian. Steve Martin's great-grandmother, Elizabeth Jane Martin, on the paternal side, still appears mixed ethnic in old photos. Martin's Davenport forebears married into the Fergusons of Western Virginia, but it would probably be going too far to speculate on any connection to the white Negro Ferguson of banjo-playing minstrel show fame. It is probably fitting to wrap up here with the two people most credited with introducing the banjo to mainstream white audiences. Two men separated by a century, Joe Sweeney and Earl Scruggs. Joel Walker Sweeney, born 1812, died 1860, one of the most famous early blackface minstrels. While Joe Sweeney claimed to have learned to play the banjo from enslaved Africans, the truth is probably somewhat more complex. Sweeney, in fact, grew up in a house with free persons of color living under the same roof, a fact which has gone mostly unremarked by historians of old-time music and scholars of the era of blackface minstrelsy. Whether these female free persons of colour were the progeny of enslaved women held by Sweeney's father or grandfather is unclear. Joe's grandfather, Moses Sweeney, appears to have been illiterate, a situation not uncommon among those slaveholders whose slaves were in fact often family members. Portraits of Sweeney himself show hints of multi-ethnic ancestry. Whether this came from African or indigenous people or somewhere else altogether, it's difficult to say without comprehensive DNA testing of related male and female descendants. Frustratingly, neither Joe Sweeney nor his banjo-playing brothers Dick and Sam fathered any known children. Joe and Dick both died relatively young in 1860. Sweeney's youngest and only other brothers, Sam, died of smallpox in 1864 during the Civil War. Interestingly, Joe Sweeney's musical sister, Missouri Sweeney, married a man named Jennings Connor, son of Abednego Connor and Lennis Ferguson. Miss Ferguson's father, Archibald Ferguson, is a bit of an enigma, an erstwhile slaveholder who was born in 1778. He died impoverished at the age of 89. One wonders if the sole slave enumerated under his name in 1840 was in fact his wife or a consort. It is again tempting to imagine this Ferguson as being connected in some way to the so-called white Negro Irish banjo player hired by minstrel show impresario Dan Emmett in 1840. Bad faith historians from the age of Jim Crow and later supporters of race eugenics tried to portray Joe Sweeney as an ingenious and talented white man who made numerous improvements and innovations leading to the modern banjo. This appears to have been a blatant attempt to separate the banjo and its newfound popularity among the American middle classes from its roots among enslaved people and the poor white and mixed ethnic underclasses. At any rate, Sweeney is a common surname in Ireland, including among the Irish Pavy or traveller community. But in truth, we have no idea where and when these Sweeneys entered America, or indeed if they were one of the thousands of families who borrowed a white surname. The extended family of early Sweeney slaveholders are found intermarried with all, that being spelled A-H-L, and again, Meaders families. The former of likely Ashkenazi Jewish background, the latter of probable Portuguese Sephardic ancestry via the people named Medaris, as we have heard so many times already. And finally, to Earl Scruggs himself, the bluegrass pioneer born in 1924, who died in 2012. Earl Scruggs is the man who did perhaps more than anyone else to popularize the banjo as an essential part of modern country music. The earliest male Scruggs ancestor born in America was a man named Henry Scruggs. It is unclear whether this Henry was the son of the Richard Scruggs who had been transported into Virginia during the mid-1600s, eventually becoming a prosperous landowner. This lack of clarity is mainly because we are faced with another early colonial doppelganger situation. Various people today claim the same Henry Scruggs as their earliest American ancestor, yet some belong to the male IM253 haplogroup typical of Scandinavia, while others belong to the male EM35 haplogroup typical of Southern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Whatever the truth of the situation, one thing is certain. The family of Earl Scruggs' third great-grandfather was at least familiar with the Sephardic Jewish community, with one Scruggs' daughter marrying the widower of a Jewish Cardozo woman, the same Cardozos mentioned at the very start of this episode. In conclusion, we have been told by experts that the roots of American country music are to be found in specifically black or white traditions, with these colors seen as being roughly synonymous with the terms Sub-Saharan African and Northern European, respectively. And yes, there were forms of music which tended to be played more often by people from certain communities at certain times in certain places. Jug bands and shape note singing are examples of such divergence. But for their own marketing purposes, the early recording industry attempted to reinforce this idea of certain music traditions being exclusively black or exclusively white, even when this simply wasn't the situation on the ground. It is bad enough that this black or white narrative is simplistic. Even worse is the fact that this way of understanding American music leaves out what is arguably the most important part of the story: a racial binary view of country music has meant that singers and musicians of mixed ethnicity, in particular the brown people and Melungeons of Appalachia, have been written out of the history of old-time music altogether, even though they are perhaps the single most essential ingredient. And even when they are given credit, they are always given credit as white people, as if their predominant ancestry and traditions were Scots-Irish or, at the very least, Northern European. This erasing of the importance of mixed ethnic people to the formation of American popular music has been ongoing and persistent, with many artists who were active in the first decades after the birth of the music recording industry seeing their ethnic history being completely whitewashed. Artists like Johnny Cash, Gene Ritchie, Chet Atkins. Even a mixed ethnic person like Elvis Presley was characterized simply as a Southern white boy. What's even more relevant to the current culture and identity wars is the way people like Presley have been accused of appropriating black music by social commentators and critics, when the story was actually far more complex. In America's binary race paradigm, Elvis just happened to fall on the privileged side of a fake social divide and was able to be seen as white. Did performers like Presley benefit from being seen as entirely white? No doubt they did. But by ancestry and culture, Elvis Presley had far more in common with mixed ethnic Southern Appalachian people and the Southern black community than with any Northern or Midwestern white communities. So while Presley might be said to have done better financially than many black artists due to white privilege, he cannot be accused of some sort of cultural appropriation. Sifting through Presley's family tree, we find the mixed ancestry typical of most poor underclass whites with deep roots in colonial-era America. On his paternal side, Elvis was strictly speaking not a Presley at all. His great-grandmother, Rosella Presley, appears to have had a number of children out of wedlock, some apparently with a man surnamed Wallace. But all of her children, by various men, carried her own Presley birth name forward. Rosilla's mother, Martha Wesson, seems to have had children by a man named Dunnan Presley, before eventually marrying a man named William Steele, who, according to family lore, got 2 of his stepdaughters pregnant. Family tradition also points to possible Tuscarora Indian ancestry, while other early ancestors, such as the Overbys of Virginia, counted free persons of color among their number. Rosilla's true Presley forebears, if they were indeed even her true ancestors, like so many other early American families we've discussed, are almost impossible to pin down. There are German Bresslers who seem to become Presleys somewhere between Maryland and North Carolina during the 1700s. There are other Preslars who become Presleys between New York and South Carolina during the same century. Some are dirt poor, others are slaveholders. Many Presley male descendants have an RM269 European haplo, while others have the JM172 haplo, common among Jewish men. Remember here what we said about doppelganger lineages when discussing the Scruggs family. In America, especially among the poor underclasses, surnames are unreliable narrators. On Elvis Presley's mother's side, there is good reason to suspect that Presley was of at least part Romany ancestry, with family members surnamed Smith using given names such as Lee and Lavelle, perhaps to signify relationships within the English Romany diaspora. In any event, photographs of these Smith ancestors suggest more than simple Northern European ancestry. What is more generally accepted, though, is the fact of Elvis Presley's Jewish roots, on his maternal side via his Berdine ancestors, said to have been Lithuanian Jews. Whatever the case, one last thing is also certain. The surnames Pressler, Presslar, Bressler are all strongly associated with Ashkenazi Jewish families of Germany and Poland. So what should be the final takeaway from this 3-part exploration of the ethnic roots of old-time American music and its later offshoots, such as country, rockabilly, and rock and roll? Well, first and foremost, people from Africa brought many musical instruments and traditions to the Americas and Caribbean, including the forerunner of the banjo. But these same African traditions underwent profound changes in the Caribbean and Americas, especially among mixed ethnic communities of the Caribbean, the Carolina Piedmont, and the Appalachian Mountains. The poor underclasses of Europe and Asia also brought musical instruments and traditions to America, including mouth harps, pocket fiddles, and the forerunners of the mountain dulcimer. These traditions also underwent profound changes there, again, especially among mixed ethnic communities of the Carolina Piedmont and the Appalachian Mountains. Even some of the music that many choose to strictly categorize as black music, such as the blues or the songs once commonly called Negro spirituals, had a genesis in a complex interplay of sources and later mixed community interpretations. The simple truth is we do not know who first sang something clearly recognizable as the blues. We can guess. A sort of proto-blues can be detected in the music played in the Southern Delta, in Creole Louisiana, and in Southern Appalachia in the decades just preceding sound recording. Does any community in West Africa share a form of music which sounds just like the American blues? No, not really. Would American blues music exist without the past input of African Americans? Again, the answer is no. But early country blues and spirituals would also have never existed without the input of non-African church and folk music. To give precedence to one strand of influence over another is well-meaning, but still wrong-headed. As for Negro spirituals in particular, the most famous Negro spiritual of all time, Swing Low Sweet Chariot, was first heard being sung by a Choctaw freedman named Wallace Willis in 19th century Oklahoma. As a man enslaved by Choctaw people, who later worked for a Presbyterian-run school for Choctaw children, was the spiritual music of Willis qualitatively different to that sung by people of color in South Carolina or Eastern Kentucky? We can only guess, as recording hadn't yet been invented. All we have are the recorded interpretations of his songs, made many decades later by people like the Fisk Jubilee Singers of Nashville, Tennessee, an African-American college-based ensemble who were tailoring their repertoire and sound to a predominantly urban and often white audience. On an almost predictable side note, Maggie Willis, one of the daughters of the Choctaw people who had enslaved Wallace Willis, married an Ashkenazi Jewish tailor and cloth merchant who popped up in Indian Territory during the 1860s or 70s, moving trade merchandise there from Paris, Texas. This was certainly not the first time that Jewish merchants had crossed continents to intermarry with local indigenous people. Goodness knows whether these Jews among the Choctaw and Choctaw freedmen had any influence on their shared music. What does seem certain in an overall sense is that the people most likely to have been innovators, people driving the fusion of different musical traditions, would have been people from communities where different ethnicities lived, worked, danced, and sang in relatively close proximity to one another. As the folklorist Nick Spitzer has pointed out when discussing the Piedmont blues, quote, "Among the rolling hills, small farms, mills, and coal and railroad camps of the rural East Coast Piedmont, between Tidewater Coast and the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, black and white economic and cultural patterns have overlapped considerably, more so than in the nearby areas or the Deep South. Piedmont blues styles reflects this, meshing traces of gospel, fiddle tunes, blues, country, and ragtime into its rolling, exuberant sound." Unquote. What folklorists have often failed to appreciate is that this overlap in economic and cultural patterns was often due to people having feet planted in both communities, not only through work and geographic proximity, but through actual marriage and real ties of kinship, reaching back to earliest colonial times. the forgotten ones, the in-betweeners, the name changers and shapeshifters, the Black Dutch and the mulattoes and the half-breeds and the Eastern Blackfeet and the Delaware Moors and Turks and the Pineys and the Portuguese, families of mixed European, Romani, African, South Asian, indigenous, and yes, Jewish ancestry, who were always treated as not quite white, a people apart. And it should be said at least once, again, that maybe being a people apart was in fact exactly what some of these people wanted. The distillers and feudists and Melungeon banjo pickers, the rambling men and sporting girls. By the time Big Coal came in and started to buy up Appalachian mineral rights, many of the most impoverished mountain people, unwilling or unable to spend their life underground getting black lung, would try to enroll as members of various Indian nations, hoping to make a fresh start in places like Oklahoma with a small government land allotment. But the majority of these mixed people would be rejected for not being Indian enough, eventually becoming, once and for all, a people wanted by no one, being neither black, nor white, nor Indian, sneeringly called mongrels or white trash. Many did eventually walk out of the hills and hollers in a final bid to escape poverty and classism and racism, only to find those revenants stalking them again in the fields and tent cities of Depression-era California and in the factories of Motor City. Most eventually managed to pass as white, meaning that the music they helped invent over decades and centuries as brown people would also eventually pass as white music. Old school country musicians like Johnny Cash and Tennessee Ernie Ford knew all this, while modern toxic pretenders like Jason Aldean appear to know nothing at all about the true roots of country music. An awful lot of stuff happened pre-recording industry, pre-Nashville, and pre-Deliverance. Almost everything we think we know about the ethnic roots of Southern Appalachian culture needs to be reassessed and reset, especially the blatant and inaccurate whitewashing of its history. The essence of Appalachian culture, especially its music, is not mainly the legacy of white Scots-Irish settlers. That is simply the preferred foundational mythology propagated by those deeply invested in their white caste identity. And once people decide to insist on their whiteness, then every cultural trait gets recruited to the service of that identity. Hence the witless posturing of cretins like J.D. Vance. Feuding, moonshining, clannishness, mistrust of government, music traditions, all are enlisted as evidence in a drive to invoke Appalachia as a sort of white Christian nationalist libertarian morality tale. I hope this podcast has demonstrated clearly that Appalachian society in general, and old-time music in particular, is profoundly bound up with people from the underclasses who were far less segregated than Americans elsewhere. Not only were they less segregated, they were often of mixed ethnicity. This writer would propose that it was this very mixed ethnicity which created a host of things now associated with Appalachian culture. People of mixed ancestry or non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant affiliation would have been the people most likely to seek out the remote mountain places and to suffer the later economic consequences of being unwilling or unable to link seamlessly into mainstream industrialized American society. And most definitely, yes, people of Jewish ancestry, whatever their skin color, were a fundamental part of these complex mixed ethnic communities. A people whose story runs like a hidden thread from 15th century Spain and Portugal to India, Africa, South America, the Caribbean, until their final arrival in colonial era North America. As these people with Jewish connections headed into Appalachia during the 1700s, whether free or enslaved, it seems almost absurd to suggest that they wouldn't have carried their music with them, including their fiddles and banjos. After all, their migration paths mirror the migration of the banjo itself. And while most have long forgotten their deep ethno-religious roots, the music remembers. As ever, my heartfelt thanks go out to the generous supporters of this podcast. I will have to ask all of my gracious patrons to forgive the subpar quality of the voice recording this episode. An unforeseen bout of severe bronchitis saw the complete loss of your host's voice during the final week of March, and even now, in late April, entirely normal speech is still out of reach. I sincerely hope that this extended length episode goes some way to making up for the loss of a March episode. Thanks to Freya, Traveler Pony, Emmy, Beverly, Heather, Elisa, Cassie, Mike, James, Jeff, Patrick, Sarah, Paula, Sandy, John, Elizabeth, Pamela, and Tara. You have no idea what your support means. Main theme performed this episode by Dave McLaughlin on bouzouki and Ephraim McDowell on the banjo.